Hi everyone again. This is the second part of the lecture on phonological systems. So in this video, I am going to talk to you about the phonological system in a little bit more detail. So in the last lecture, in the last video, you saw how phonological systems are a set of rules along with the elements that are present in a particular language. So, in this video, I'm going to introduce you to a conservative view of phonology, a view that recognizes that the phoneme or the allophone distinction uh, between three rule types, that is, the morpholexical rules, the phonemic rules, and the allophonic rules. So, the kind of model that we are going to talk about will attribute a central role to the constraints, both at the phonemic as well as the phonetic level, but not as the only agents in phonology. So, in contrast to optimality theory, where constraints are the only rules and constraints are the only things that work, in this conservative view, where phonological systems are available, we will be looking at a system which is rather the application of rules at, at various levels. Pardon me. This kind of a framework actually captures certain unavoidable distinctions, although many models have tried to eliminate several aspects of it. So, I will now indicate how the various models deviate from this conservative model. Now, therefore, the question arises is whether at all phonology is necessary. Why do we need a phonological system to operate? So, when we look at various ways of representing the speech, it comes to light that you know it is self-evident in language that it is a collection of speech utterances, and that is dependent on a certain set of rules, both hierarchical as well as something of a linear order, linear nature. So both of which together gives rise to the properties of grammar, which universal grammar would agree that it is a property of the human mind. Now, this mental grammar is something of a basic system that consists of constraints and rules and their combinations, which generates an infinite set of linguistic expressions, which you can then go on to understand, or something that you produce continuously, and there is no limit to how many different linguistic expressions that you can have. And each of these linguistic expressions have some meaning and a certain form. So you have what is called an internal language, or what Chomsky calls an I language, that is there as a part of your deep structure. And then you have something which is called external language, or e language, again defined by Chomsky, which basically has two parts to it: the phonological form and the logical form. Now, this external module that is there is brought about by linking the concepts from a third type of information, so which are basically perceptible units, perceptible events. Something like a psychological acoustic mapping, and which is also a kind of a mechanism that maps onto the articulatory framework. So you have the articulation of a particular sound. Say, for example, you have the vowel E. Your articulatory system has a certain configuration, and When you move your articulators in a certain way, that configuration is either stable or dynamic. But what it leads to is some kind of an acoustic output, which then ultimately goes into a form which is a psychological attribute, which is basically an auditory percept. Now, this is what is called the perceptible form. The information is basically captured by this perceptible form. Here, I would like to point out that phonology, here for me, it would be defined as a module that achieves this externalization of the linguistic expressions. So, in short, it is some kind of a logical system which is a representation of the internal or I language. It seems to me that this module is an internal part of the Chomskyan mental system, which he goes on to call the narrow language faculty. But it is basically a terminological issue. And we have covered in detail uh, about how the basic system of Chomsky's aspects model in a later lecture. For our purposes, for this particular video, I'm going to define Chomsky's conception of the mental grammar, which illustrates only one aspect of the utterances, that is, traditionally has a domain of the syntactic forms, and mapping it onto the phonological form, that is, a linear order or string. It's like a, so you have these garlands, or you have this the set of beads on a string, kind of, so in terms of a perceptible form. So this therefore Chomsky's syntactic structures is more like, you know a string of perceptibles that come, which is time dependent, which is temporally in nature, and that leads to some kind of a stable system in speech. Now, this linearization is a clearly, it is a necessary part of the entire externalization system. And the principles or conventions that govern this specific linear pattern is mostly non-phonological in nature. So, why does phonology uh, come up as an important structure in when you want to understand the this speech systems? Traditionally, both phonology and phonetics seem to refer to the study of sound, and it leads to the often heard equality about language is synonymous with speech, but that is not the point over here. The point is that when we include when we include these rule systems in an abstract notion, these become the emic part or the phonological part. The phonetic part is restricted to just the translations of the articulatory to a certain parts of uh, the attributes which govern it towards, or which takes these features that we were talking about, the distinctive features, into the realm of the phonological setup. So it uses the auditory system, and therefore the question arises that why do we have these two disciplines, phonetics and phonology? Are they different, or are they similar or the same? Well, typically, phonology is a term that includes phonetics and, in addition, phonemics. This view comes from the American structuralists' view. In this view, the phonetics studies the complete array of physical aspects of language or linguistic form in terms of its acoustic, articulatory, and auditory properties. So, while phonemics focuses on the properties of the signal that are distinctive or contrastive in nature, so this part becomes this aspect becomes a part of the phonological system, the definition of the phonological system. And in practice, non-distinctive phonological properties are relegated to the phonemic part of the entire system, and in fact is an underspecified part of the lexical representations as well. So, what happens when we look at the general form of the phonetic theory or phonological theory, in fact? So, you have what is called an input function, which forms the derivational aspect of the theory, whereas both inputs and outputs together they form the representational part. Now, phonology consists of both the derivational as well as the representational part. So, in fact, phonology is defined in terms of two functions. One is the phonemic representation, two allophonic or phonetic representation, and the second one is a phonetic representation to a phonetic event or an acoustic event that takes place. Taken together, they form a discrete compositional structure that, uh, that comprises of the basic units, which are called the primes, and which are either deemed universal or innate or language specific and learned, and that are combined in accordance with the universal and language specific constraints that are put onto them. Now, Roman Jakobson's work in the 1940s and subsequently developed by Font and Chomsky and Maurice Hall, so they take together and form what is called sequential phoneme work, and they're decomposed into smaller simultaneous units called the distinctive features. And the motivation for so why are these motivators, why are these necessary? Because such smaller subphonemic units are where the rules often refer to, or where rules often operate. So that is why they become necessary. And then there is a three distinct levels of representation. You have one mental or symbolic, then you have the phonetic or articulatory level, and then you have the mental conceptual level. Each of them are connected by a kind of a unique discreteness in the mapping systems. So ideally, it actually implements and what is known as a kind of a phonological model with where the phonemic representation through the allophonic rules come to the phonetic representation, which is an articulatory plan, and then it is implemented by a physical event, the output of the physical event, which is an utterance. Now, the phonetic level, on the other hand, is an important unresolved question where, due to various paralinguistic factors, people restrict oneself from phonetic properties, and which are then again necessarily a lower level of analysis or implementation. So, knowing what kinds of properties could be distinctive leads us to a kind of understanding about how to, conceptualize this mechanism of phonological system. As I was talking about in the previous video, a particular phonological system is specific to a particular or a distinct language. So you have language systems or phonological systems of, say, Punjabi or Bengali or English, but universally there is some kind of a systemic pattern where each of these linguistic inventories or phonemic inventories fall into the rules that apply to these each of these subsets lead to a potential distinctiveness which then be specified as a particular language. Now, why are these important? Because these ultimately lead to what is called a paradigmatic and syntagmatic patterns, and where there are certain constraints which are phonotactic in nature. They lead to the phonological rules being set up. Obviously, then the fully specified phonemes contain certain redundant properties, and therefore there are several ways in which these unspecified in the linguistic representation they are unspecified in the linguistic representation. Now, these features that are there would therefore lead to something of a mechanism in which there are different phonological rules like neutralization, devoicing, or even something like a phonetic allomorphy, which operate at the morphophonemic level. So the point that becomes ultimately necessary is what is the necessity of such kind of geometric features, or rather representational features of a phonological system. Obviously, the reason is that you have a geometry of the phonological feature or the notion of the feature bundle. So it was a well-known characterization of phonemes by Bloomfield as bundles of features which gave rise to this view, and wherein you have a two-dimensional feature matrix which basically leads to a normal interpretation of a particular phonetic element or a particular uh, element in terms of whether it's a consonant or a vowel. Each of them will have a certain binary feature that would give rise to these mechanisms, these systems rather. So in effect, a phonological system would consist of the inventory of the a particular language, like a set of vowels and consonants, and diphthongs and all other uh, elements of that nature, maybe even a syllabic level construct, alongside certain morphophonemic rules that would apply to each of these levels in a natural way of expression of these relationships. So, this kind of a multi tiered representation is a basic model of a feature organization that ultimately leads to some kind of a mechanism in which the representation of speech in terms of feature specifications are achieved. So this conception resembles a construction that is basically a representation where the fundamental observation is that the gestures that accompany these go on to produce certain simultaneous and sometimes partially overlapping gestures, which give rise to the degree of interactions between these systems. In our next video, we will see how these feature classes are constrained and elaborated into a set of phonological systems, in particular, giving examples from uh, two languages in particular, that is English and Bengali.